if I'm walking by like a construction site or something that's loud, I reach for my phone to turn down the volume.
Yo, 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 yo. Welcome back to the weirdly introed Wild Business Growth Podcast. This is your place to hear from a new entrepreneur every single Wednesday morning who's turning wild ideas into wild growth. I'm your host, Max Branstetter, founder and podcast producer at MaxPodcasting. And you can email me at max@maxpodcasting.com to save time with your high-quality podcast. This is episode 190. I'm not even going to mess around and say it in like a weird way. 190. And today's guest is Arielle Nissenblatt. Arielle is one of my favorite people in the podcast space. She is one of the most influential people, one of my favorite people to follow. She is the founder of EarBuds Podcast Collective, an awesome weekly newsletter that curates 5 different podcast episodes for you to listen to every single week in all sorts of different themes. She also manages community at Squadcast. She's super involved in a bunch of different podcasting events. And in this episode, we talk all those things she's really good at, including community when it comes to podcasts, curation, which she knows maybe a slight thing about. We even talk about curating curators. And of course, consumption, because she has listened to more than one podcast episode in her life. It is Ari this and that. And here's a little bit of this and a little bit of that. Enjoy the show. Alrighty, we are here with Arielle Nissenblatt, this and that. Dude, we could just keep going on rhyming and rhyming. But the world's greatest podcast listener, I think, is what is going to be cemented in the legacy. Arielle, thank you so much for joining and all you do in the podcast community. How you doing today?
I'm spectacular. How are you?
I'm spectacular as well. I was not expecting a spectacular there, but here
I wasn't
we are,
either, if I'm being honest. I didn't know it was going to come out of my mouth.
It is a spectacle, after all. But we're going to get into a lot of what I've summarized your career as the 3 C's of podcasting: community, curation, and consumption. And so, in addition to setting a record for alliteration and spectacular spectacles, we'll get into those. But before that, I've been dying to know this. What would you be doing if podcasts just like evaporated off the face of the earth and for some odd reason, like podcasts just weren't possible?
Yeah, that's a question that I think about a lot. I thought about it yesterday because I heard that there might be a recession. And I was like, what if they cut podcasts? And I was like, what would I do? And I was very nervous because I realized that I've really been honing this skill set of knowing what's going on in the podcast world. I think that what I love about the podcast space is that it feels new and like there are a lot of possibilities. So I have thought that if there was no such thing as podcasting, or if I needed to go in a different direction for whatever reason, I would look for something that also feels new, something that also feels like it's in its infancy or relatively new into the world.
You mean like toddlers?
Yeah, I'd go after toddlers. I think I would look at like a green energy source. Like maybe I'd work for solar or wind or something like that. Or the other option is this is a little depressing, but I really like the fast-paced nature of hospitals and how everything is changing all the time. And I have no desire to be around blood, but maybe there's something for the non-blood people in hospitals that I could, latch onto.
We'll start curating a list of bloodless hospitals, and you'll be first to get the call there. But yeah, no, I think that adds a lot of perspective to it. I think there is something exciting, like anybody who loves the podcasting industry, there is that aspect of, no matter how many years it's around and into like double digits years now, like it still feels so new, and it is so new compared to so many other things that are out there. And I think it's going to be new for a long time. So there's that special energy there. Back to real life. So clearly, like it is certainly not the case that podcasts have evaporated. So, and thankfully, like you found quite a home and have built quite an influence in this space. And I'm going to go out and say that you're well liked. So sorry,
Aw.
Yeah, you really screwed that one up. It's because you have discovered podcasting. Can you take us back to the first moment of it, like unlocking in your brain? Oh my God, like I'm learning stuff through my ears and this is cool.
Yeah. And that's what I call it too, is learning things through my ears. I'm not kidding. I really do. There's a few origin stories for me. The first is I'm sure that I had heard the word podcast before 2014, but I don't really ever remember consuming them actively until 2014. I had just graduated from college and I moved in with a friend, and she would listen to podcasts while cooking, and I was like, what is that? What is that story? How do I get that story in my ears? And that's when I started playing podcasts while I was driving, while I would go on long drives. So that's one of them. But at that point, I wasn't thinking about podcasts critically. I was just like, wow, I am entertained while I'm driving for 5 hours at a time. And that's pretty amazing, because in the past, I have felt like I was going to fall asleep while driving, but now I feel like I could go forever. That's my introduction to listening. And then my introduction to the industry more so was I had just moved to Los Angeles in 2016, and I had to commute for a job and was stuck in traffic all the time, and realized that I continued to listen to podcasts, but I wasn't miserable in traffic, because, once a podcast ended, I could choose another one and learn a whole new thing. And I also owe that to 89.3 KPCC, which is the local public radio station, or one of them. And yeah, learning through my ears is a thing that I started to really think about in 2016. I was constantly listening to stay informed. And then I would call that like my lead in to becoming a listener, is that I wanted to listen to news coverage. And then I was like, you know what? How else can I learn through my ears? What other stories can I hear? And so from there, just constantly filled my brain with audio stories.
Well, Arielle, this has been great. We're actually going to interview your ears for the rest of the duration because there's some even more first-hand experience there. But I think you stumbled onto a very cynical but probably true way of looking at the podcast industry, that like when times are dark, podcasts can just help you to not be as miserable. And I think whether it's sitting in traffic or just like dealing with whatever shit you're going through that day, the gimmicky word or industry word or whatever marketing word is escapism, but there really is something there of value in being able to escape and learn in different spaces that these podcast worlds create. To those 3 C's: clarity, no, I'm just kidding, community, curation, and consumption. So this is kind of more for you, Arielle, and your ears, into kind of getting into your actual career in the podcasting space. So let's start with community and Squadcast. Anybody who's recorded or been around doing interviews in the podcasting world for X amount of time, a decent amount of time, has heard that more and more about this company called Squadcast and this platform, which has really, really good reputation, like awesome quality stuff. And you lead community for them. So how did you go from somebody who was just like a little less miserable in the LA traffic, which shout out my fiance's brother Adam, there's always LA rush hour traffic, to working for Squadcast in their community role?
In 2016, was listening to podcasts, was not totally jazzed about what I was doing job wise. I was working for nonprofits and I thought it was fine, but I was not, I didn't feel like I was being challenged. I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do, but I really knew that I liked listening to podcasts. And I thought, what if I could make a career out of this in some way? And so I started saying out loud to friends and family, like, I will work in the podcast world, whatever the podcast world is. And they were like, okay, but can you really get paid to work in the podcast world? And I was like, that's a good question. Let me find out. So I just started cold DMing and cold emailing podcasters in the LA area that I admired. I just started, listening to shows and seeing who was in the credits, and then saying, okay, this person, I heard you're based in LA. Can I take you out for a coffee and like learn about how you got to do what you did? And where I was hung up was a lot of those people were in production. They cut tape, they edited tape, they interviewed, they scheduled interviews, things like that. And there were a few career paths within that I thought I could do. But for the most part, I was like, I don't have a production background. And that feels like something that might stop me from entering the podcast space. So with that in mind, I started on the side looking for entry-level production jobs or internships, things like that I could do on the side of what I was doing. But I also had the idea for a podcast recommendation newsletter, which is where the second C comes into it, curation. And I started a podcast newsletter on February 13th, 2017 called EarBuds Podcast Collective. And the reason was because I was listening to a ton of podcasts, but I wanted to listen to more podcasts. I'll explain more about the newsletter in the curation section, because right now you asked me how I got to work full time.
Yeah. This is very shout out to like growing up the Nickelodeon slime. Like if you skip 2 C's ahead, you definitely get slime, but one is like you're kind of on the edge.
I'm just teasing it, I started this newsletter and used that newsletter as an excuse to meet with more podcast people. Hey, I have this curation newsletter. I'd love to have a phone call with you about your podcast. I'd love for you to curate a list for me. And connections begat connections. And I just started, having opportunities come up. So then later that year in 2017, I loved the look of co-working spaces, and I really wanted to be able to work in a co-working space for free. This was before WeWork, tumbled down. And I reached out to a bunch of different co-working spaces and essentially pitched myself as the podcast curator for them. I thought, you should have a book club for podcasts and let me be the person who facilitates that book club. And a few places got back to me. I had a few conversations about that possibility, but one place in particular was like, we want a podcast studio. Can you build it? And I pretended to know what I was doing. And I built them a podcast studio. And then I worked there for about 1.5 years, filling the studio with clients and building it and, finding equipment and finding engineers. And that was my first official job in the podcast space. I did that while running the newsletter. And then I worked for Castbox after that, the podcast listening app. And then in 2020, I saw that, and I skipped a little bit. So if you're curious about any of that, please let me know. But really, it comes to the point where in August of 2020, Squadcast, which I had been using for a podcast that I started at the beginning of the pandemic, they had a job opening for a community manager. I looked at it. I said, that is a skill set that I have. Let me apply for that. And I did. And I've been working there since August of 2020. And it's a lovely company to work for. Such a welcoming environment, such a creative environment. And we're really on a mission to make things easier for creators. And it's just such an awesome environment to work in. So yeah, I've been running the community there for a little over 1.5 years. And I'm happy to talk more about what community is, because that seems to be a question that a lot of people have is, what is community management?
So curation. So no, I'm just kidding. So community, yeah. I'm not gonna ask the same exact question that you hit, because I can't make it too easy for you. But like, what's not community? No, I'm just messing with you. So like the thing that fascinates me is that like it's a really organic journey for you of discovering podcasting and finding that you have a passion for it and figuring out like, okay, I need to get involved in this industry. What's the best way for me to do it and help people out and yada, yada, yada. How did you learn how to do community stuff, as I so eloquently put?
It's a really good question. And I'm careful to say that it's an inherent skill that I have, because I think anybody can learn anything with the right amount of passion. But I do think there is something to be said for the fact that I naturally have ideas that come up that are community based. And I think that has a lot to do with my upbringing. I grew up constantly thinking of ways to entertain myself and my friends. And I learned later that is community management. I've loved trivia since I was in high school, and I constantly come up with trivia events that are, homegrown, not just like going to a bar and playing trivia, but also like having friends over for dinner, and not just having dinner, but having games that are dynamic and that have us having conversations that are beyond just gossip.
I'm with you on that trivia front, by the way. That
hell yeah.
I recently filled out an updated bio of myself for a client site because they want to put me on, which is I'm very honored. Shout out Ash and Aiden. But I wanted to add, some more personality, I wanted to stumble over my words. I wanted to add some more personality to it. So I said that, You know, he's also edited so many podcast episodes that he is a true asset to any trivia team. And I think for you, like anybody who edits or just even listens or curates, you know, to
so
a
many
crazy
fun
amount of
facts.
podcast. Totally. Yeah. And it's like, my dad always called it random useless knowledge. And that was, you know, before podcasting, but it totally, like, podcasting is a space for random useless knowledge that sometimes can be useful in certain areas, but trivia, I think you like for all the episodes you listen to, like you really should like carry the torch with Jeopardy or have your own trivia show or something like that, because
I did try out for
gold.
Jeopardy in 2010. And by try out, I mean, I did that quiz that they have and I did not make it, but that was before I discovered podcasts. So you really never know.
Was that like a BuzzFeed quiz?
No, it was like from the Jeopardy website. It was something that you sign up for and they send it to you and it's timed and it's really intense. And in my opinion, much harder than Jeopardy actually is.
There you go. All right. Well, next time. But anyway, so that's the trivia detour. But back on your route of community. I don't know how to say that word. So you literally like create these trivia, like you found ways to entertain people and paralleled that to community, which I never thought of it that way before, but it's true.
I didn't either until I was given like the pedagogical context for it. And I'll talk about that a bit.
Yeah. What does that mean? I've never heard that word in my life.
Well, I don't even know if I can define. We'll cut this.
Maybe not.
Basically, it's a learning style essentially. So when I look back in retrospect of what led me to where I am today, I am very community oriented. I love, you know, hosting trivia. I love having dinner with my friends and having a point to that dinner beyond just hanging out, right? You know, and of course, hanging out for hanging out's sake is amazing with very close friends. But if you're going to involve people who are kind of on the outer tiers, I think it's really awesome to have some sort of connection bringing you together. And that definitely extends when you're going to professional contexts. I think it's really helpful to have there be a set of cards at the table where you can discuss X, Y, and Z, or maybe a framing question for the discussion that you're going to have, just to bring everybody together in a way that allows you to bond over something. So I started at Squadcast in August of 2020, and the job description essentially said that I would run the community, whatever that would mean. And I defined it in one way then that probably has some similarities to how I define it now, but now with added context and added education about what community management is. So when I started a newsletter for the Squadcast community. I started featuring Squadcasters on social media and started calling them Squadcasters actively, started calling the community Squad Pod. Sometimes it's just about naming the community and saying that there is a community and asking the community what they want and finding out if they actually want to hang out as a community or if they have too many other places on the internet that they're already hanging out as a community with other software programs. So this was my whole thought process when I started early on in the job. And then in April of last year of 2021, I did a program called On Deck, the Community Builders Fellowship. And that's where I learned some of the history of community management, of community building, of where it sits within organizational structures. You know, is it part of the C-suite? Is it part of the whatever B-suite? I don't really even know what those terminologies are.
You're just inventing suites. It's pretty sweet though.
Yeah. And that's when I learned, you know, how to build a community on Slack, how to build a community on Discord, how to gather people who want to be gathered and leave the people out who don't want to be gathered because they're already on too many internet community websites and things like that. So that's where I really began to solidify the community strategy of Squadcast, which, you know, we have thousands of customers, and those customers, some want to be involved beyond their recording sessions, some do not, and some want to be somewhere in between. And how can we capture those people? And ultimately, how can we make them be evangelists for the brand so that they will say, I'm part of the Squadcast community and you should be too.
What is your, and this is like, if this is, you get sued by On Deck, you can just point them to me and they can secondhand sue me. But what is your number one community building tip? Like the most important thing?
Ask the community what they want. So many people are hearing the word community and saying, I need to start a community for my podcast. I need to start a community for my brand. I need to start a community for my software. And the truth is, entity can have a community attached to it. Even McDonald's can have a community of beta taste testers. McDonald's can have a community of, I don't know, kids who test the Magic Playground or whatever it's called, the playgrounds, and like decide that they want the slides to be this color. That can be a community, right?
I think it's called the B Suite, actually.
Yeah. Any sort of company, even like I'm holding a water bottle right now. There could be a water bottle community around this brand called Keep Two.
You just made that up, but yeah.
They could be people who love this water bottle brand because it really helps them stay hydrated throughout the day. And as part of this community, they share on Slack or they share on Discord every day how much water they drank, and they inspire other people to drink water. And that could be a community, and that could be a strong community, but it also could be a completely unnecessary community. So my advice is that if you're in charge of a software, or if you're the community manager of a software, or if you're the community manager of a podcast listening app, let's say like Good Pods, which I know that you are a fan of.
Yeah. Shout out JJ.
Yeah. Shout out to JJ. I think the best thing to do is to gather the people who seem to be fans of your product and ask them if they want to be involved further. And if they want to be involved further, have a call with them, ask them what it means to them to be involved further. Ask them how often they want to meet, ask them where they want to meet. And then from there, you can establish some protocols that maybe will extend to other people who join, but more likely you'll have to keep reevaluating what community means to these people and to the new people who join you.
Arielle's community building tips are super, super duper flooper. They're helpful in the podcasting space. And if you are looking to build community and leverage a podcast as a way to do that, open more doors for your business, your brand, maybe your personal brand, maybe like a half personal brand. I don't know what that is. Hit me up at max@maxpodcasting.com. I will take loads and loads of time off your plate when it comes to starting a podcast, editing your podcast, which is tiring just thinking about it, and providing the marketing elements you need to get that podcast out into the world. Hit me up at max@maxpodcasting.com to save time with your high-quality podcast. Now, let's shift to curating some curation about what needs to be curated. So now that you're on a total roll with community, I'm going to switch it up because why make it easy for you? Curation, which you may or may not have teased a little bit beforehand, but it's just awesome that you created EarBuds Collective and that there was just like a market, there was an opportunity there for curating really, really cool or fascinating and new podcast episodes, and for people to discover them when they previously had no idea they existed. And I think what's really cool is you do it around the theme, and you also get other people involved in, submitting stuff to you as well. What do you call them? Guest curators?
Yeah, curators.
There you go. I call them the Fighting Arielles, just to name them. But so you have kind of at the time that you're doing this, you're a listener in the podcasting space and you're toying around with it a little bit. But what really spoke to you of like, hey, there's a real opportunity here for curation. People are really going to dig this.
The reason I started the newsletter as a curated newsletter, not by me every week, but by having a guest curator every week, was because I was listening to 5 to 10 podcasts every week, and they would renew every week. And that was great. And I really enjoyed it. But I wanted to listen to more podcasts because already at the time in 2017, there were hundreds of thousands of podcasts out there. And I knew that those podcasts were amazing, but how could I find the ones that were so great? I was listening to some that were blowing my mind every single time I listened to them. I was learning things that I couldn't even dream up before. And now I was being exposed to these new stories and these new people. And I wanted that to happen all the time. I wanted to have my mind blown constantly. And so I couldn't do that on my own. I needed other people to blow my mind. So I thought, if Max can curate a list of his favorite podcasts and JJ can curate a list of her favorite podcasts, I will never run out of different perspectives to listen to. And so that is why I started the newsletter the way I started it. I do listen to enough podcasts at this point to curate a list entirely on my own for people every single week that I think are great. And I do that sometimes. I have a newsletter that I sometimes write in called Podcast Plunge that I go more in depth on what I'm listening to. But for the most part, I am just such a big fan of finding out what it is that is playing in your ears and what you're learning from podcasts and how I might jive with what you're learning from podcasts.
What would you say is behind the art of podcast curation? I felt like I was 75 years old when I said that.
Well, what's interesting is I say that anybody at EarBuds can curate a list. I say this every week on my podcast. I say EarBuds is a weekly podcast recommendation newsletter and podcast where each week is curated by a different person. Anyone can curate a list, and I mean anyone. You can be a podcaster and you can curate a list and include one of your own podcasts as part of that list. You can be a subject matter expert and curate 5 podcast episodes on that subject matter that you're obsessed with. You can be somebody who just wants to challenge yourself to find 5 podcast episodes on a theme and then present that. And that's great. So really anybody can curate a list. And my job as the curator of the curators is to make sure that those podcasts I want to make sure that they're diverse in scope, that it's not just white men curating lists of white men interviewing white men. So I have rules in place when you're curating a list for me. So I have a form that you fill out. And when you fill out that form, you agree that 3 out of 5 of your podcast picks are going to be hosted by or produced by, or the prominent person being featured on that show is a person of color, a non-binary person, a woman, just somebody who is traditionally underrepresented in media, in podcasting, in life. So that's for me what it means to be a curator. And I didn't have these rules in place at first. I made mistakes early on. I approved lists at the beginning of the newsletter that I would not agree with approving now. And it's much easier to be able to point to something that's written on this form that you are agreeing to when you agree to curate a list for me. And I would say for me, that's what it means to be a curator. Yes, I am looking for shows. I don't listen through to every single episode before it goes out. But over time, you come to recognize what a show is just by listening to the first 10 minutes of it. And then another question is, what is my responsibility if on the 11th minute of a podcast that I recommended, the host says something that I do not agree with? Right. And those are questions that I don't have the answers to right now. And I think that's okay. We'll get there. And I'm open to not only criticism, but advice and ideas. And I think that's what it means to be a curator, is to have an open mind about what could possibly entertain not just me, but other people.
Yeah, hands down, you're taking the right approach to it. And it's awesome how much it's grown. And I mean, there's so much content, like you can't personally, and even with the team, like you can't, scour every word in every episode. So I'm sure like occasionally something slips through that's like, oh, whoa, we probably shouldn't have recommended that. But more often than not, that's not the case. And for anybody who, whether they aspire to be like you and curate podcast episodes for their audience, or it's something else that they want to, maybe it's like they just like collecting things and sharing interesting stuff with people. What have you seen as feedback and kind of a response from the community since you have started curating and sharing these valuable, and I'm sure sometimes all over the place, episodes with people?
When I first started the newsletter, I knew that I was obsessed with podcasts, and I knew that a bunch of my friends were obsessed with podcasts, and we wanted to fill our ears constantly with new stories. And I thought, there must be other people like this. I will have 100,000 subscribers in no time. That was what I thought. And I will be able to make a living off of those 100,000 subscribers by selling ads or by having a Patreon model or whatever it is. 100,000
true fans.
True fan. Yeah. Yeah. 100,000 true fans, 1 million true fans. Who knows? It'll happen one day. You have to believe. But it wasn't having this spike in growth that I was hoping for, that I truly believed. How could people not want to subscribe to this newsletter about different themes every single week to open their brains and expand their horizons? And then somebody pointed out to me that it's not a niche newsletter. It's not a newsletter that if you love cats and you want to know everything about cats, you're going to subscribe to, because maybe one list per year is going to be about animals, and maybe one of those episodes is going to be about cats. But mostly you're not going to get what you're looking for if you love a specific subject matter. So it's not really a newsletter for everybody. It's a newsletter for people who are interested in being exposed to new podcasts constantly. And that weirdly, maybe paradoxically, is a smaller section of the planet of my 100,000 new true fans. So yeah, I mean, it's been an interesting journey to figure out like what people want from a curated newsletter. The cool thing that keeps me going is that I don't get a lot of unsubscribes. So clearly it's resonating with people to be subscribed to this newsletter and to receive podcast recommendations on differing themes every single week. And I think that has a lot to do with education on my part of things, you know, in the onboarding emails that you get in the drip campaign. When you subscribe to the newsletter, you're told what this newsletter is. And when you subscribe, the landing page tells you what this newsletter is. So you either subscribe or you don't then, and you're, according to my statistics, most likely not going to unsubscribe. So it is, from an email marketing perspective, I've learned a ton. And I've learned how to make my emails prettier, and I've learned how to make people want to stick around. And from the curation perspective, I think it is a joy to be able to be pitched on new podcasts that are coming out all the time, from indie podcasters, network podcasts, and then considering featuring them in the newsletter in some way or another. And I can speak way more about like the pitching process, but man, we have a lot to talk about.
We do. Yeah. And I just added like 7 more C's to this list. So I hope you block out the rest of your week. By the way, I think your cat example is perfect, because maybe the reason you have so few unsubscribed is because a lot of people in your audience aren't huge cat fans, and they like to hear about cats once a year. So I think that's the secret.
I think that's exactly it.
Yeah, knew it. All right. And then the final C of 24 is consumption. And I joked at the start that you are the world's greatest podcast listener, but I really think you might be the world's greatest podcast listener. So congratulations. You've worked hard for it. Your ears are probably tired, but
I feel like I need to shout out a few other really great podcast listeners.
You can. Yeah.
Can I do that?
Yeah, of course.
One of them is Lauren Passell. She listens to, I think, more podcasts than me, and she listens at 3 times speed so that she can really get it all in. And some people find that disrespectful. I do not. She's a tastemaker. She needs to figure out what is worth it to listen to at a regular speed.
Wait, what's the I'm blanking on the name. What's the name of her company again?
Tink Media, and her newsletter is called Podcast the Newsletter. And so her newsletter is a love letter to podcasts, and it's not curated by other people. It's curated by herself. And I'm a big fan of it because she always says this: if you're not a fan of Lauren, you're not going to be a fan of the newsletter.
Oh my God. Anybody else that you want to shout out, or is that good does that feel a little bit better?
Yeah, I do. I have a few actually, and I'll shout them out very quickly. One of them is Shreya Sharma, who writes the Inside Podcasting newsletter. She listens to a ton of podcasts. Another one is Brian Barletta, who is the writer of Sounds Profitable. He listens to a ton of podcasts, business podcasts, but then also tabletop role-playing games podcasts, which is a genre that I, have been exposed to through him. So it's really amazing what's out there.
It is. So for on this consumption/listening part, I'm just fascinated. I mean, I'm somebody who listens to a lot of podcasts, and that keeps growing and growing, but I'm sure you're like on another level on top of that. What's your advice for anybody who aspires to listen to more and more podcasts?
Subscribe to all of the podcast recommendation newsletters out there. And it's a good question that you just asked, because clearly people have this question. If you go on Twitter for just a moment, you'll find people saying, I just went through my whole queue of podcasts. Does anybody have any new podcasts to listen to? And I won't even go into the fact that is inviting tons of people to just spam their link onto that tweet. I won't go into that and how you shouldn't do that, but you can ask me about that offline, listeners and Max. But you should subscribe to all of the podcast recommendation newsletters out there, because you will find curated lists for you, either curated by other people, as is the case for EarBuds Podcast Collective, or curated by these newsletter writers themselves, like Find That Pod or Podcast Delivery or Lauren Passell's Podcast The Newsletter or WTF to Listen to, or I'm kind of blanking right now. Oh, Great Pods is another one. I could go on all day. There are so many of them. Podacy podcasts. And then, so that's a really great thing to do. And then another place that I've been finding a lot of podcasts to listen to is the Castbox homepage. So Castbox is a podcast listening app that I used to work for. And because of that, I still listen using their app and GoodPods. Those are my two apps that I use to listen to podcasts right now. And I love the podcasts that are displayed on the home pages of both. But then GoodPods has the extra added layer of having a feed. So if I scroll through my feed, I can see what you're listening to. You can see what I'm listening to. I can comment on your post. I am not somebody who listens to a lot of celebrity podcasts on my own, but if I'm scrolling on GoodPods and I see that Crystal Profit has listened to a podcast from Smartless, I might press play on that podcast. And that is really the power of a social app for podcasts, and that is GoodPods. So again, shout out to JJ.
Yeah, and shout out to Crystal Profit, the best last name in history. Also on, we'll call it listening or consumption behavior. You alluded to it with Lauren, but what is your thoughts on listening speed?
I listen faster. I listen at 1.8 usually. I don't usually go above that.
That's like that clearly that was like the limit. Like, oh God, two I can't understand.
I have done 2 in the past when I know a show really well and it's a news show and I am listening to it so that I can learn something very specific. If I'm listening for enjoyment, I like to slow it down. But if it's the daily and I need to learn about what's going on in Russia that day so that I can be informed on what's going on in Russia that day, I'm going to listen fast, especially because that is going to be backed up by what I'm listening to on Up First and also on Start Here and also on What a Day and also all the news podcasts that I listen to in order to back up the claims that are made on one podcast. I want to make sure that I'm also hearing similar things or differing things on other podcasts. But yeah, I can listen to news podcasts a little bit faster because I'm going to be hearing it again from a different host when I press play on the next episode.
Does it ever like mess with your mind over time when there's a day that you're listening to a ton of stuff on almost double speed? Do you see any side effects of that? Side effects sounds harsh, but
no, you're probably right. I'm sure that I talk faster because of it.
What are you talking about?
One thing is I listen to podcasts so much that if I'm walking by like a construction site or something that's loud, I reach for my phone to turn down the volume. And then I realize that I'm not actually listening to the construction site through a podcast. So that is definitely messing with my mind, but I'm aware of it.
Yeah. It's extra tough if somebody has like an alarm or dog barking or something going on in the background and they're recording and like you really can't tell if it's like I have
real
to pause
life or
it.
The metaverse.
Yeah. Well, you took it to a different direction.
But yeah, has it messed with my brain at all? Probably. I'm sure that when I'm in person, want to speed up some conversations.
Yeah. This one included. So sorry about that.
Yeah.
Music. And the last thing here is
I don't listen to music. Is that what you're about to say?
Yeah, but you just spoiled it, so I'm going to have to ask it again
ahead.
just to punish you.
You redo it.
And do you ever mix in music? And if so, how much?
It's a very good question. And I'm not just saying that to buy myself time because I think a lot of people when they're recording podcasts, they like to say, that's a really great question.
Well, that's actually a really great comment. Yeah.
So just watch out for that. Podcast consumers and podcast interviewees, that is definitely something that we know what you're doing. And I have just bought myself 30 seconds. So do I listen to music? The answer is I do, but really not often. Like I am not up on what is new. I prefer music that is old, like classic rock, which makes me sound like a dad, but
hey, I love classic rock.
I love this radio station called 107.1 The Peak, WXPK in White Plains. And yes, I really love it. I've been listening to it since I was in high school. It's the kind of radio station that you turn on and everything they do is perfect. Everything they do is perfect. Every song you're like, how did they know? So it just does everything right. They have this segment at 10 a.m. and 10 p.m. each day called the 10 at 10. And they play 10 great songs from one great era. And they choose a year and a month. And then they play not just songs from that year and month, but also like movie trailers that came out that month. It's the best. It's so that I love 107.1 The Peak. Such a big fan. They just turned 18 and I'm just proud of them and love them so much. So yes, I listen to music in the background. Like when we're done with this, I will say, hey, Google, I'm saying it quietly. Play 107.1 The Peak. That's what I'll say. And I'll have it on in the background. But then I also play WNYC in the background. So definitely I just recently became part of a Spotify family plan. And I really only did it so that I could see like what the podcast infrastructure was up to. I don't listen to podcasts, to music on it very often. In 2020, my most played song was Hedwig's theme from Harry Potter.
Oh, yeah. A new one.
I don't even know. I just like it came up on my like Spotify Wrapped and I was like, I listened to this. Like it was my most played. I don't understand.
Oh my God. Better than fan noises. It's the best when you see people with fan noises coming up as their most played. That's great. Let's wrap up with some rapid fire Q&A. You ready
Yay.
for it? All right. I couldn't tell if that was a real yay or sarcastic yay or what.
No, I love that. Let's go.
I'm going to ask these slow because I know you'll listen back faster. No, that now you're really going to jump off. But all right, let's get wild. New York or LA at this moment?
Okay, right now LA because it's so warm and sunny and I was just there.
Oh, on that note, geography, something you studied in school and kind of geek out about, which is awesome. I'm kind of the same way, but what is it that just gets you really excited about geography?
Maps. Love. Oh, and public transit. I love public transit. Maps in general.
Perfect. All right, we'll save the cartography section for next time. What is a quirk you have that friends or family, somebody calls you out for, but it's just a little quirky about your personality, but it's who you are?
My family says that it's always the Arielle show, which is not very nice. I'm loud. I like to make a lot of noise. And I also like to, if I'm on a Zoom call and 6 people are talking at once, I say, Aunt Ellen, you now. And then Rachel, now it's your turn. And my sister's like, Arielle, you can't do this like a podcast. So that's a quirk.
The Arielle show. Well, thank you for having me on today, Arielle. But last thing, a trivia question that is your all-time favorite or you like to just wow people with.
What is the deepest lake in the world?
Pennsylvania. No, I thought this was a riddle. I have no idea. Loch Ness?
It's Lake Baikal, which is in Russia. It's 5,392 feet deep. It's not that interesting. It's just something that sticks in my brain. It's pretty deep. It's
good. And now you know, in case it ever comes up. So perfect. Well, Arielle, the show, that doesn't go in order, but whatever. Arielle, thank you so much for coming on the podcast, sharing your 3 C's and multiple extra C's and talking frequency, speed. But really, really appreciate all you do, and can't wait for the next newsletter. Where like there's a million places in the world to find you or interact with you. What is like your number one go-to spot if somebody hasn't connected with you yet?
I am most active on Twitter, which is twitter.com/Ari this and that, or you can just search Ari this and that.
Perfect. And last thing, it could be it's final thoughts. It could be a quote, a line, another lake, whatever you want. Send us home here.
Oh, fun! I should have this prepared.
Silence actually works. Like that's a good little bait and switch there. Episode 190 and the first ever silent thoughts. Thank you so much, Arielle, Ari, this and that, for everything you do for the podcasting world and for sharing your story and insights and tips with us today. And thank you, wild listeners, for tuning in to another episode. If you want to hear more wild stories like this one, make sure to follow the Wild Business Growth Podcast on your favorite app and tell a friend about the podcast. And maybe even start drawing maps with them, like turn into cartographers and just start, being map people. You can also find us on Good Pods, where there are plenty of, as we noted, amazing, awesome podcasts and plenty of people curating them in a very awesomely fantastic way as well. And for any help with podcast production, you can learn more at MaxPodcasting.com. Until next time, let your business run wild.
Bring on the bongos!